And we're live. How you doing?
Hey, good. How are you, Daniel?
I'm pretty good, Lindsay. How's things over there?
Going well. We got a nice spring day here in Pennsylvania, so we're enjoying that. And I just got up from a nap because my daughter had a big sleepover last night and we didn't sleep very much.
Yeah.
So I'm good now. I had my nap and I had my coffee. So,
So,
how are things in
good.
Dublin?
Yeah, we're the same. It's kind of it's the beginning of spring, and as
Yeah.
you can see, the sun is roaring down on me. I'm getting both my vitamin D and also doing a live stream on literary discussions. So, it's
There you
who says men,
go.
who says men can't
Yeah.
multitask?
Now you're gonna get a sunburn over there?
Well, as a redhead, I have to be careful. So
Yeah,
it's
me
really
too, as blonde. Yeah,
yeah.
I gotcha. I know. I'm like a walking freckle. I've got
So
a lot of English blood.
yeah,
So,
and
yeah,
Irish and English are a lot closer than they want to admit. That's the sad
that is
fact.
true. Yep.
And on the subject of Irish and English, for those of you who've just tuned in, myself and Lindsay are going to be talking about our respective novels. Lindsay's novel is Nemesis and the Swan, which came out in October last year, published by Blackstone Books, and it concerns the plight of a young woman who is caught up in the upheavals of the French Revolution. Have I got that correct?
You've got it correct. You're good.
Good. Good. And I'll be, in the meantime, we're going to be comparing my novel with hers. My novel, A Land Without Wolves, is going to come out in October this year, and it concerns the 1798 rebellion in Ireland, which itself was strongly influenced by the French Revolution and altogether less successful, if I do say so myself. And more or less, me and Lindsay were brought together by Annie MacDonald of the Right Review and Right for the World review. So she's watching. Cheers for bringing us together because it's we've got an awful lot of ground to cover and probably I think only what is it, an hour. So hopefully some scintillating discussion will kick off. So Lindsay, without further ado, tell us a bit more about Nemesis and the Swan.
Sure. So it is there on the shelf behind me, and it is technically a young adult historical novel, but it definitely has an adult crossover. It's kind of, I find all my writing kind of in that sweet spot of upper YA.
Right.
And so it follows the story of Helene Diabine, and she is an aristocrat, but she's had a very progressive governess who's kind
Mm.
of given her an education with the Enlightenment philosophers. And this was not what her parents were paying this governess to do, but she has all these ideas about what does it mean to be free, and what does it mean for me, because she's never really felt like she's fit into her family situation, and yet she doesn't really fit in with the people out in the streets either. She's kind of caught in the middle.
Mm.
And I think this is something, it's a feeling that I had growing up, where I kind of would end up caught in between those extremes and not necessarily quite fitting in 100% to either one. I still find myself there today, and in all of this interesting conflict here in America. I have a
Yeah.
lot of people that I care about on both sides, and that can be difficult. So I definitely infuse that into my character, thinking about what's it like to be caught in a more moderate place in a very tumultuous time. And fortunately, we don't have a guillotine or, mobs going through our streets here. That's a plus, but she's definitely caught in between those worlds. And to make matters worse, she is in love with a jeweler's apprentice, someone she's not allowed to marry. And so she has to really decide, who am I? Am I part of this aristocratic family? Am I, do I belong to myself, or where is this all going to fall? And so what will ultimately give her the answer to that is the interesting brooch on the cover, which is something that I came across in my research. Let me grab it off the shelf. I should have done that before.
No problem.
Okay, here we go. So right there, it's the lover's eye jewelry, and this is something that she finds, and it ties into a kind of dark secret in her family that gives her some insight into her identity, and it will affect the outcome as she faces the mob as well. So there's a little rundown without any spoilers. Dan, would you like to tell us a little bit about your novel?
Well, my novel is called A Land Without Wolves, and It's set in the years leading up to the Irish 1798 rebellion, which and it concerns the story of a highwayman called Joseph McChera, who's McChera is another word for wolf, and he doesn't have any real feeling for the political struggle that Ireland's going through at the time. He's more just on this kind of one man mission of revenge against the world for some very traumatic instances that occurred in his childhood. Very brutalized family being the least among them. So he more or less praised equal opportunity on both British redcoats and Irish rebels, and just views them all equally as just targets. And his story starts to change when he takes this young boy under his wing, and who he discovers has a bit of a knack for knife fighting, and he basically molds this boy into being his replacement. It eventually turns out, but far from being just the Clint Eastwood character with an Irish accent, he also loves to read. He doesn't care about stealing money or jewels off his targets, but he just uses them as means to an end. If he wants to steal anything, it's going to be book, and he has his whole an underground library in his hideout, and he teaches the boy how to read. And of course, the books he's going to show him how to read are going to be many of the Enlightenment philosophers, many of whom he regards with contempt, but nonetheless he enjoys to read them. So he represents in some ways the dark side of freedom, and as time goes on, his very nihilistic view of the world starts to come back to eat him up, really. And meantime, his young apprentice, who's quite handy with a knife, also becomes quite skilled in reading and begins to question this life that he's become embroiled in, as it were. And we still haven't quite gotten to the rebellion just yet, but the rebellion's just around the corner, and it's going to be the body count is going to be high, and no one's going to get out alive, to be fair. So that's my one. And similar to yours, it's all about how these ideals of the Enlightenment, really, by the time I suppose the 1790s have come around, I suppose the ideas of Rousseau and Voltaire, to name but two, and Hume as well, have begun to take fruit, and probably not in the ways they would have imagined. Would that be a fair estimate?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I love that both of our stories have sort of this mentor character introducing a younger character to these texts, and just that importance during the Enlightenment of all these people having access to these new ideas and asking themselves, like, who's in charge of me? Is it the
Yeah.
king? Is it my dad? Is it me? And in so many levels, like from the huge political scale to just personal thought, and
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting how influential those texts were at that time.
Yeah, and it really was an era of unprecedented change in so many ways. And yet, at the same, as we know, and this is probably more true of your book than mine, there were still certain demographics in society that were being kept down because, well, that was always the way it was. And you have the likes of Kant and Hume and several others talking about emancipation and freedom, and yet yet many of them are still also slave owners. And it's at least, and certainly George Berkeley, who's known as being the Irish philosopher and a contemporary of Jonathan Swift, he was known as being a slave owner as well. So, and we're kind of going, well, how do we? And the emphasis on writing a fictional novel set in an historical era, how much do we actually put our contemporary lens on and our understandings on what these people thought?
Mhm.
For them, for us, is probably quite reprehensible, but for them, was perfectly normal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something, I mean, especially in America right now, we're still dealing with that, with issues of, do we take these statues down, of George Washington or whoever, because they own slaves.
Mm.
And I think for the French Revolution, France was a little more progressive with those issues. And there was a Society for the Freedom of Blacks. And actually, in my story, one of Helene's defining moments was she goes to a salon, which is like what, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it was sort of like a little meeting of minds. They would go, men and women would go together, they would talk about ideas, they would eat, and they were seen as equals. So her
Mm.
governess takes her along to one of these and says, "This is a secret. Don't tell your parents." So she comes along and she meets her governess's boyfriend, who is a freed slave. And he is giving this talk about, you know, um, all of these horrible things that have happened, and he lifts up his shirt in the back and shows all these scars that he has on his back.
Mm.
And that was something that I took from my research, that there were men like this who were going into the salons and talking about their experiences. So because you don't want to just have that, like, well, everybody thought just like us, because they
Mm.
didn't, but I tried to find some examples of that, like what's something that my character might actually see that would make an impact on her, and so I really thought about those scars would make a huge impact on me,
Yeah.
and she sort of she realizes, that also her governess is in love with this guy and they can't be together.
Mm.
And that's so unfair. She's upset about it, and it hits a chord with her because the boy that she's in love with is also illegal for her to be with for different reasons. So I tried to kind of blend in those things that would make sense for my character, but that would bring in some of those Enlightenment ideas without glossing it over, changing it, and making it sound too modern, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah.
Oh, it does. I mean, yeah, and that's always the tightrope walk in a lot of ways, because at the same time, we're not writing historical. We're not writing as historians. We are writing as fiction writers, and we're trying to tell a
Right.
good story. And
Yeah.
again, we also have to wonder, well, how palatable is this to a contemporary audience as well? And that's always a
Yeah.
consideration. Honestly, I'm thinking to myself, well, people did think that, genuinely thought that way, and it wasn't a problem. There were free thinkers for sure.
Mhm.
I mean, Wilberforce
Right.
was definitely one, and there were still people who thought, well, hang on now, there's still human beings being enslaved here. That's not cool. It doesn't matter where they're
Mhm.
from, who they are. It's just
Yeah.
that you're holding human beings as property. But that was a minority view at
Right.
the time.
And I
Uh,
think too, as we write historical fiction, like part of having characters with depth is that they're not one thing or the other completely. No one is completely good, no one's completely bad. There could be a character who has a lot of great qualities, but they have opinions that don't jive with mine, and can we portray them in those gray areas realistically, and I
yeah.
think that's important too.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it's not a case of the other side as well, and even just on a character basis. I mean, my hero Joseph McTierna, he's ruthless, and he'll happily butcher anyone he comes across, but he also loves to read, and that's
Mhm.
favorite is John Milton. And so and one of the things and this is very true in Ireland. I don't know what the case was in France, but certainly in Ireland, this was very true. Illiteracy was widespread, but a lot of people were also bilingual. They could speak English and Irish with equal levels of fluency in lots of cases because, well, they had to, because occupying
Mhm.
force. So if you were at home on the farmstead, you'd happily be speaking Oskelga, but if you went to the market to the market square, you'd probably be speaking in English. And yet illiteracy was very much the norm. At the same time, there were also these things known as hedge schools, which were like um, illegal schools for the tenants, for rural tenants.
Hmm.
And it was also not uncommon for children who were farmers, the sons of farmers and peasants, to be reading, ancient Greek texts, and
Wow.
learning Latin as much as
Uh-huh.
anything else. And this was kind of very much and this was that was the norm in a lot of places as well. So there's all these different things coming together, and there's a fantastic play by Brian Friel called Translations, which touches exactly on this. And you have all these peasants who you think are illiterate, but actually they can converse to each other in ancient Greek. And this was apparently quite true,
Mhm.
because of these little schools. Because if you were the schoolmaster, you were something of a, you know, you were held in high standing. You were an educated person within this community of people who didn't have your skills at reading, and you were called on to sort out legal documents or whatever else. So it was
Mhm.
that for me kind of that just fascinated me. That kind of, what if I had a literate this guy who's very much a thug, but he's also self-educated.
Mhm.
It's not entirely unusual. It's not entirely
Yeah.
implausible for the era. So it's just in terms of depth, shading of
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Now, do you find that with the Irish Rebellion, were those Greek heroes a big deal? Like as far as the iconography, because definitely with the French Revolution and the art of the French Revolution, it was a big deal. They kind of
character.
went to all of the Greek heroes and the fatherland and all of that stuff. Was that part of the Irish as well?
Well, what's interesting about the 1798 rebellion is that it's a combination of both the United Irishmen, who themselves were inspired by the French Revolution, and were very much the college educated like middle class gentry, and they're all men, of course, um, all meeting in coffee salons and debating, well, Catholics in this country are and Protestants are all Irish, and therefore Irish people should have more um, sovereignty from the British Crown, and that was what that was a major talking point for much of the 1780s, 1790s with Grattan's Parliament. In the countryside, however, it was a very much an agrarian dispute. You had farmers who were paying taxes to Protestants and Presbyterian um, landowners, and they held the power. And so, and a lot of them couldn't get jobs outside of, let's say, joining the army or joining the navy or anything outside of very, very, very basic peasant work. So they were being kept down as well. So it was all these different things coming together in a lot of ways. And the iconography of 1798, from what I can see, is that it was very much Wolfe Tone himself was a Presbyterian, college educated, and went over to France actually to enlist French aid to aid to bring about reinforcements, more or less, and that didn't work out at all. But Wolfe Tone himself has been commemorated as something of a martyr for the Irish people, which is an idea that, if you read his work, he probably would have found completely. He would have just raised his eyebrows at, because he didn't really hold with romantic ideals of dying for one's people. He killed himself in prison, but it wasn't necessarily because out of some romantic ideal. And of course, romantic as I mean it came just a little bit later. It was still the era of William Blake, but as we understood it, it was still going to take its toll later on. Mm-hmm. So the iconography really much is really only came about more or less after, and there was a sense that it was that independence could probably be gained from the British Crown. They were crushed completely, and but it left a mark, certainly. But I think the duty we have as writers is having to sift through all these kind of understandings of it and realize, well, was it as heroic as they say? I mean, people were also set on fire in their houses. Irish people turned on their neighbours and happily locked them up in their barns, birth life, women and children included, and you've got Irish lads wearing British Army uniforms, or working for the Wymanry and all this, and they're probably taking aim at their neighbours on the battlefield. It's which unfortunately is true throughout Irish history, from even the American Civil War to World War One. There's always a case of Irish people just joining up on opposite sides and taking each other on, and probably without even knowing it sometimes. So it's just very messy the more you look into it. There's always this idea of it being a very heroic struggle, and then you look into the actual reality of it and you go, it's actually more heartbreaking,
Yeah, I definitely see that with the French Revolution too. And I think growing up, I didn't really learn a lot about it other than, off with their heads, let them eat cake. That was kind of like the main, in America anyway, you focus on the American Revolution. But I didn't really learn a lot about the French Revolution until I got to college. And when we're talking about the art, I have a picture this was in my college art textbook. I don't know. See if I can get the glare off of it there.
Oh, I know.
The Death of Marat is a painting by Jacques-Louis David, and it portrays this guy as this angelic martyr, but he was stabbed to death in his bathtub by a young woman. And that, what? What girl would come in and stab some guy to death in his bathtub? So I was intrigued, coming from an art history perspective. I love art, and I love art history in the way that it kind of shows you how people are seeing things in a certain time, And so I started to read more about this guy who is portrayed there, and he was one of the most bloodthirsty guys as the revolution went on. And so Marat, he's in my book, he features in my book, and his literature is coming out there saying, kill all the aristocrats. Like, we need the gutters to run with blood. Like, that's how we're going to be free. And so Helene, my main character, finds herself like, okay, that's my blood that they want, but she's not responsible for those things, and so she's really grappling with that, having to hide that part of her identity and feeling like, what does my blood make me? But just looking at how someone like that can be portrayed as either a monster or this angelic guy, it's crazy. And you can see, I think it is just a human tendency to want to categorize things as this or that, good or bad, black and white, when really there's so much gray. And I think that's something really powerful that stories can help us to see, to listen to people whose opinions are different from ours, instead of, chopping off their heads. That's usually a good thing.
Yeah. Well,
um,
we could argue we're still chopping people's heads off now. We just do it on Twitter these days. That's the modern
yeah,
way to
that's
do it.
a whole new revolution, right?
Well,
Yeah.
does it even deserve that? I mean, it's still I suppose, the human need to, have at one's enemies or one's perceived enemies as it is. And I suppose from what you've read about the aftermath of the revolution, because we do, because even I remember reading about it in school, and it was the reign of terror that gets focused on afterwards. Like, was it actually a success? Was there actually a did it succeed in what it did? I mean, it's opposed the king, but then the regime that came up in their place, what exactly was it? Was it an improvement? Was it worse? I mean, you hear all these, and
It was terrifying. Yeah.
yeah,
And you were talking about the Irish, turning on their neighbors. I mean, this was like a super condensed time of that, where one day you're on the right side, the next day you're dead,
yeah,
and nobody could trust each other because whoever was in charge changed like overnight,
yeah,
So I think it's definitely that little microcosm of a lesson that we can look at and say, oh, how can we do better? So
yeah.
yeah.
And it's probably true of a lot of popular uprisings as well. There is this sense of, well, we're going to change what went before, probably for good reason too.
Mhm.
And then what gets replaced is actually more often than not even more extreme and even more. And it's always a case of, well, at the same time, you know, when certainly going from the Irish example later on, several centuries later, when the 1916 rebellion happens, and that was a complete failure by any stretch. To put it very mildly, it was a group of lads with no military experience taking over a post office.
Wow.
Yeah. Which when you put it like that, but we call it, but because Yeats wrote about it and it's the glorious cause, and they were all shot at the end, they were all executed in prison. Had they not been executed in prison, it was it probably would have been a footnote. But and no and there was very little support for them in Dublin or across Ireland. There was support, but it was definitely a minority thing. People were quite content to be. It's difficult to imagine now, but people were quite content to be citizens of the British Empire
Hmm.
because it worked. Things were getting by. Things were on an even keel, and then you got these lads coming into the GPO and on Dublin's Sackville Street, now O'Connell Street, and just saying, what are they doing? They're taking over. They're causing issues, and there's a whole rake of Irish lads out in the Somme right now getting shot at. It's a and that's that kind of scenario, but it's now commemorated as this being this glorious blow for freedom, which in a lot of cases it was. But the way it's taught is always in such a, I think anyway, it's always taught in such a sanitized way, you know. And this, and again, and where you're in Philadelphia. I understand Philadelphia is the heart of the American Revolution, which is seen as probably far more the success the French Revolution was not, or if I got that right.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't have that huge backlash, I mean, it was a success kind of straight away. It didn't, go into a reign of terror, luckily.
Yeah,
And so at the end, well, I'm not, no, I shouldn't say that. That's a spoiler. Never mind. You'll have to read the book
yeah. I'll have to read the book.
to know the end. But played so heavily into the French Revolution too, because so many guys went and fought in America because the
Mm.
French helped the rebels, so they
Yeah,
had these ideas of, wait, we're putting our lives on the line for these other people to be free. Now we're going to go home and be ruled by our own king. So, that was a
yeah.
huge factor for a lot of men who had gone overseas.
Mm.
So,
And I
um,
guess and the rhetoric that gets influenced as well is the fact that Wolfe Tone himself went over at least twice to France to enlist French
yeah,
aid, and
uh-huh,
his appeal was kind of that they had all these guys as well. Like I think I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but I believe it was General Hoche, who was the Admiral Hoche was the he raised a fleet, and were it not for inclement weather, they probably would have landed. The biggest irony of it all was that Wolfe Tone himself was actually not in the country for the majority of the 1798 rebellion. So while it was going on, he was actually overseas trying to raise reinforcements, and then the second they get there, it's over, lads. Game's up. It's So
Yeah.
if anything, it's almost like a horrible trilogy: the American Revolution, glorious; French Revolution, terror; Irish,
Yeah.
down the hatch.
Yeah.
Bleak.
Yep.
And the other
Now,
problem as well is sorry, go on.
oh, no, that's okay. I was just going to ask you, as far as talking about Poetry Month and
Yeah,
poetry. I know you write a lot of poetry. Do you have original poetry in your novel?
not original, no.
Okay,
Unless it's
but you
probably
have
just.
period poetry.
Well, yeah, I tried to.
Okay.
One of the things I actually enjoyed when I was writing mine, and I don't know if maybe you got this as well. Actually, reading the text from that time, reading not just 18th century texts like Hume and translations of Marcus Aurelius, but also just soldiers' accounts and even just the poetry from that time, Alexander Pope and what a lot of his couplets, and try and just get that voice down on the page. This kind of this archaic, what we to our ears a very archaic 18th century sound without going full 18th century either.
Yeah.
But
That's always a challenge when you're trying to write
yeah,
that authentic voice, and yet you want it to sound like something someone wants to read now.
yeah,
So,
it's
yeah.
the struggle is real. But
Yeah.
for me, I mean, largely Joseph McTierna. I mean, I won't deny he is very much there's elements of the Byronic hero in there. So who's he going to read? John Milton. He's going to think Satan's my man. He's just going to sit down. He's not going to put it quite in those terms, but he'll
Yeah.
But there's a scene where he's sitting in the cave, in his hideaway cave, and he tries to the way he kind of gets this boy to join up with him is by more or less he more or less recites Milton to him as a way of just kind of saying, "Join me." So he kind of just says to him, he quotes from Book 12 of Paradise Lost, namely, "Hunting and men not beasts shall be his game, with war and hostile snare, such as refuse subjection to his empire tyrannous. A mighty hunter thence he shall be styled before the Lord, as in despite of heaven, or from heaven, claiming second sovereignty. From rebellion shall derive his name, though of rebellion others he accuse." And that's kind of just the way of saying, "Join me.
Very,
Let's
yeah.
declare war on the world." So
Very nice.
we got lots of Milton in Land Without Wolves.
And then you don't have to worry about, copyright or anything, right? Because it's plenty far out of out of date. The thing that surprised me as I was working on including period texts in my story, because they were originally in French, we had to be careful of when the translation was published.
Yeah,
Like the public domain stuff, because I just assumed, okay, this song is 200 plus years old, we're good. And they said, well, you have to look at the translation. Because what I used a good bit of in mine are popular songs. And I'm a music nut. I love music. And I really like, kind of along with the way that I look at art history, I like to look at music history and what it says about, the songs that are stuck in people's heads. What are people going around their day, sweeping their floors, singing? What are they doing?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so, um, as the mobs are gathering and they're butchering people in the streets, they're singing as a group, which makes it all the more terrifying. You're like waiting in your house, are they coming for me? And here are these singing people with bikes.
Wow.
um it's a whole new layer of creepy.
Mm.
But
And they're
I
probably
took
very
a couple
jubilant songs as
lines.
well.
What's that?
They're probably very jubilant songs as well. They're probably very.
Yes.
So you hear that coming down the street. Oh fuck! Take
Yeah.
cover.
Yeah, for real. And especially if they're coming to burn down your mansion, but they're just
Yeah.
all these songs that were part of the popular canon at the time. And so there's one that I used a few snippets of it to kind of punctuate the action, and it was from the Marseillaise, which is basically, it's become the national anthem now, but they don't use all of it anymore.
Right.
So my main character is waiting. They're shut up inside this house, waiting to see what's going to happen as these mobs are marching. And it's men, it's women, it's children. Like people brought their kids. They're like, here's a
Mm.
fence post, Junior. let's go
Yeah.
impale a marquee.
Mhm.
So she's waiting there, and they're hearing, to arms, ye brave, the avenging sword unsheath. March on, all hearts resolved on victory or death. Now, the dangerous storm is rolling, which treacherous kings confederate raise. The dogs of war let loose are howling, and lo, our homes will soon invade. O liberty, can man resign thee, once having felt thy generous flame? Can dungeons, bolts, or bars confine thee, or whips thy noble spirit tame? To arms, ye brave. And I thought that was such a dramatic song to imagine these,
Yeah.
foot beats coming for you,
Yeah.
So I think it's great to include stuff like that, just what ordinary people would hear and know.
Yeah. That's it's kind of fascinating to consider because all this time I've been listening to, in keeping with keeping that 18th century um, atmosphere alive, I've been listening to the likes of Haydn and Mozart
Mhm.
and Gluck and all these composers who probably would have been, I suppose, you know, but of course that they would have only been heard um, in the courts and among the gentry and the aristocracy.
Right.
The ordinary people would not have heard this, and
Mhm.
and I just thought, and then I realized actually my characters would never have heard a harpsichord in their lives. They'd probably never have heard a string quartet, maybe a
Mhm.
choir when they break into church to rob the poor box. But that's kind of, but that's kind of the last of. But and it's something that I was about 6 months in and I started taking that for granted. I realized, wow, these guys they've never actually heard this sound that I can just stick on. I'm listening to a random YouTube playlist of 18th
Right.
century composers. These
Mhm.
guys would never have heard that,
Right.
like, unless they break into someone's house in the middle of a recital. That's when they hear it. But, it's
Yeah.
it's remarkable. And so what were the marching songs like? And I haven't been able to find them, but I have to go back to the drawing board now, just from what you said.
But yeah, I think we take that for granted,
Yeah,
that because of those revolutions and those people that have
yeah,
said everybody needs access to information and
yeah,
art and all that stuff, we're like, well, I'll just pull it up on Spotify, that's
yeah,
easy. Where, most people in the past had no access. They didn't have a public library.
yeah.
So,
And
so
only
yeah.
the very. What was the? I think you can answer this for me. Was it what was the journey that young men had to take across Europe? It was like the very rich young men had to take that journey across Europe, like the Grand Tour, was it? So
I don't know.
it was, yeah. Was that maybe it was later? I don't know, but it was like a tour that sons of the gentry had to take across Europe, where they go to various cities and
Just
just
to like be cultured and meet
yeah,
people.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, just
I don't know what the term was for it. But
generally live lives of very elegant decadence. I think would be the would probably be the most accurate term. I
yeah.
thought maybe would that have been around the same time? I'm not sure, but
Yeah, I don't know. Now, do you find yourself reading contemporary poetry also, or do you stick pretty much period stuff?
well, I mean, you can't just the period stuff. I mean, the thing will probably just get a bit stale as well. I mean, hilariously, another writer who actually has a lot of influence is the Western writer Larry McMurdy,
Okay.
because there are some Western elements in the story, even despite the setting. It's Europe and it's the 18th century, but there's Western settings. There's lads on horses. There's shootouts with soldiers. There's the hunt for treasure and all this kind of stuff. And so I try to. Larry McMurdy is one writer I like as a contemporary writer. I mean, he's dead now, but close enough. And another one would be
Not dead as
yeah,
long, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's and again, I've just been kind of keeping my ears to that. But it's been I've had to limit a lot of my intake because I don't know if you get this as a writer, but I can't. There's only certain kinds of media I can take in when I'm writing something. You know, I don't really, and I tend to limit myself. Just stick to this, stick to these texts from that era, stick to this or that because you need to just keep that. And that's probably not the wise decision to make. But I kind of think if I start watching too many modern things, that's going to seep in as well.
Mhm.
Something that's going to rub off, and then before you know it, Machira is probably going to say something like, "Give me the lowdown" or something, and then I'm gone. My editor's gonna look at
Your
me and say,
editor will catch it. Yeah. And I think I'm the opposite. In some ways, I go as broad as I can, and I try to
yeah,
look for, like when I read poetry, there are different kinds of poetry, people.
always.
I'm a definitely a very emotion focused poet, and I like kind of poems that paint a kind of clear emotional picture, like an image,
Mm,
that you have that like nice heavy ending line where you're like, "Ah, yeah, that's
mm,
that's what life is like." I kind of like those.
yeah,
um and so I try to think about, how am I capturing an emotion in a poetic way in a scene? How am I connecting with my character? And I think some of those emotions and experiences really go across time.
mm,
So if I'm reading a novel set, in like the 1950s, but a character is experiencing something similar, it can give me insight into that emotion, or I look a lot at my own experiences and how can I kind of translate that feeling? How can I translate that experience into the past? So for my character, she's definitely caught between those extremes. One of the other things that I've kind of taken from my life, and poetry that I had written as a teenager too, that was translated like 20 years later into this novel. I didn't know half of my family. My family did not get along, and my parents are together. They're great, but extended family.
mm.
I didn't meet my great grandmother until I was 17,
Wow.
and she was dying, and she asked us to come and see her. And so my mom took me and my brother and sister to see her, and it was such a crazy experience because she was this wonderful, sweet, warm person, and I had all this grief about this family that I didn't know. And what was this stupid
Mm,
argument that split everybody apart? Because nobody would tell me. It was very weird. And so I had written a poem about that feeling of, holding hands with my great grandma as she
right.
was getting ready to die and meeting her. And that same scene found its way into this book. When Helene leaves Paris, she's forced to go into hiding with her mother's family, and she's never met them before, and she doesn't know why. And so she has that same moment, and so that was really meaningful to me. And it was, I try to draw on that timeless emotion and then add in, those historical layers of detail and politics and mindset and everything, but I'm definitely a very emotion focused writer. So I try to take that, and I have readers tell me like, those are the things that made me cry. And I'm like, well, yeah, I cried about that myself when it happened to me, but it's kind of funny, but it helps me to make that
Yeah.
meaningful connection. And so I would often, as a teenager, I was, all angsty, sad teenage me, writing these terrible poems, that they
Yep.
have literally been burned. I burned them so that no one would see them. Like, they're gone. But it was, the feelings that came out, but I definitely drew on that image that I preserved in poetry and translated it into the prose. So
Right.
that's one way I think about it anyway. And one of my favorite poets is Billy Collins,
Yep.
and I know he's very commercially, palatable.
Nice.
Um,
He's made a good living of us. Can't blame him for that.
Yeah. And I don't like all of his poems, but one of my favorites is, you okay if I read one of my favorite Billy Collins
Oh,
poems? Is
yes.
that cool?
Please,
Okay. See, this
over.
is my Billy Collins book with all the little things. He was a literature professor, he's not a total hack.
No.
But he goes free verse, and it's very much those like accessible images with an accessible emotion. And I like that. Um,
Cool.
so one that kind of sums up the way that I look at my writing in general is called The Wires of the Night. And I'll read it and then I'll explain, I guess.
Cool.
As I thought about his death for so many hours, tangled there in the wires of the night, that it came to have a body and dimensions, more than a voice shaking over the telephone or the black obituary boldface of name and dates. His death now had an entrance and an exit, doors and stairs, windows and shutters, which are the motionless wings of windows. His death had a head and clothes, the white shirt and baggy trousers of death. His death had pages, a dark leather cover, an index, and the print was too minuscule for anyone to read. His death had hinges and bolts that were oiled and locked, had a loud motor, 4 tires, an antenna that listened to the wind, and a mirror in which you could see the past. His death had sockets and keys. It had walls and beams. It had a handle which you could not hold and a floor you could not lie down on in the middle of the night. In the freakish pink and gray of dawn, I took his death to bed with me, and his death was my bed, and in every corner of the room it hid from the light. And then it was the light of day, and the next day, and all the days to follow, and it moved into the future like the sharp tip of a pen moving across an empty page. And I always really connected to that, I think, just because of the idea of taking something tragic or something emotional and that slow process of, processing it internally, and then it's something you write about, and it turns into something that's moving into the future like that. So that kind of is one way that poetry influences my work.
It is. And you're kind of looking at this going, well, it's a case of, as you said as well, I mean, we're translating multiple things here. We're trying not just in some cases language, but also experiences, and it's how we do that via language. And language itself as well is in some ways a very imperfect tool for that, because language is constantly changing. I mean, we're not speaking with the same cadence and language as they would have in the 18th century for a start, and people are probably easily, I think, even a century from now, assuming we're all still here, please God, people will listen to maybe this recording and just say, well, but it's amazing how they spoke. It'll be so alien to them. You know?
That's so like 2021.
Yeah. That's 2021.
Just wait till you have kids, and you'll realize just how much of an alien you actually were like 20 years ago.
Yeah. I blame the internet myself, but that's I was just at that sweet little limbo just there where we didn't quite have iPhones coming out of our pockets, so we just about got away with it. And then it was the generation afterwards. I think they were the ones with the memes. They grew up with the memes. That's how I say.
Yeah. Yep.
For those of you who don't know, kids, a meme is I won't bother.
If you don't know, just read historical fiction.
If you don't know, just Google us. Google, by the way, is a. But you're right. I mean, there is in taking your experience and then transplanting it into your heroine story. I mean, what that shows that suffering and grief in particular has no border or no boundary and no real custom to follow. I mean, I suppose there's a similar scene in my story where we have Machira as a boy before everything comes down on him, when he's just a boy, like a farm boy, kind of going to the local hedge school, and he suddenly realizes he loves to read, he loves books, he loves to, he's just sitting in the classroom realizing what is this wonderful new thing that this journey I'm embarking upon, where I'm suddenly I'm in the South Seas looking at these exotic birds I'll never see. Suddenly I'm in, these mansions. Suddenly I'm off the Greek coast watching Troy burn to the ground. It's he's seeing all these things happen just by sitting in a classroom with the sea winds with these Irish sea winds kind of threatening to batten the door down, And it's and I remember I had a similar feeling like that when I was a kid, when I started in primary school, and it was a case of suddenly there's this like language is suddenly not just sounds I make with my mouth. It's actually it's a skill I'm being taught, and it's only going to get better from here on in, which led me to write. And I'm kind of going, well, I could finally actually put that experience down on paper after nearly 30 plus years on the planet. So it's kind of 30 plus. No.
But it sounds like that's really what is kind of your character's redeeming quality, and like that thing that you connect with him, because you said he's like so violent and bloodthirsty, and yet he has this real love of books and learning. So it's interesting how you find yourself.
And he's completely well educated. It's not as if he's some gentleman made bad. He's been a peasant all his life, but he actually managed to learn how to read and not only that, think for himself. And we
Mhm.
Faust was thinking as well. He views all ideologies and all group thinking as just a problem that he has to just fight and attack, which
Mhm.
isn't great either. There's a That's a very absolutist way of thinking as well. But it's given his life experiences, it's understandable why he'd reached that conclusion. I
Mhm.
hope becomes
Yeah.
clear. And but yeah, I mean that would definitely be my understanding of it. And then later on, when he recites Milton to Moog, I think I read Milton first when I was about 15, and it's those rhythms. He's not Milton is very unusual even for his time, because he did write strict rhyme, of course, but Paradise Lost is those thunderous rhythms that just keep building on themselves, and there's no kind of it's not like a rhyme and meter A B C D C
Mhm.
D. It's very much its own music and its own kind of um it's almost like it's actually the beginnings of rock and roll in some ways. Are there this pounding, very almost
Mhm.
industrial feel to it. So it's a and I just thought, how is he going to convince this kid to join in this cause of basically attacking caravans and all this kind of stuff? Quote him Milton. You want to know more of that, lad? Join me. I'll show you to read more. That's kind of he's taking this very good thing and just almost corrupting it in a way. But that's his arc as well. But
Yeah.
I won't give away too much.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting how like people are so connected to those rhythms, whether it's, music and the marching songs or
Mm,
just, the rhythms of poetry and how they stick with us and make us
yeah,
feel something. I think that's really interesting. And one of the most powerful things about poetry, because I mean, you can look at everything from Tennyson to like, I mean, Harry Styles, if you want to go there, I mean, it's poetry. It's not the same, not the
yeah.
same caliber, but it has
Wait,
rhythm
wait,
and
wait.
it's something that's.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
sorry, doing poetry. Is
Well,
it,
song
is it
lyrics,
spoken word? Yeah,
songs are poems, right? I mean,
yeah,
poems set to
yeah. Fair
music.
enough. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, can you
Um,
tell that
hmm,
I have a 12-year-old? But, it
little
is
bit.
there's that rhythm and there are those images and there's all different kinds of
Yeah.
levels of, what's the word? I don't know,
Well, it's,
commercialism and
well,
and everything, but,
well.
you know
There's even a line in the Bible with in one of the I forget which. I believe it's one of the letters by Saint Paul, where he talks about well, it's all many modes of operation, but it's all the one spirit. And I'm not religious, but I think, well, that's what we poets do.
yeah,
There's always some new methods to do. And even here in Ireland, I mean, but where I am in Dublin, like pre-COVID, we had a pretty vibrant spoken word scene, and and of course as well, and it's an interesting facet that emerged in the last 10 years. All these very spoken word artists in Dublin alone, but across the country, in fact,
mm,
just and using a very Irish vernacular, which actually quite suited the rhythms of spoken word. I wasn't really involved. I did more kind of my own thing, but it was something. So it was a great thing to witness. And what's fascinating is that as well, when Queen Elizabeth during the Elizabethan conquest, prior to that in Gaelic Ireland, we had bards. We had a bardic tradition. We had a bardic tradition of people who would constantly write lyrics detailing usually the topics of the day in the 15 1600s. And overnight, as Elizabethan forces more or less made Ireland into a dominion of Britain, that vanished overnight. And it's kind of but it's regularly a case of a spoken word performer getting up in front of a crowd of people and relaying their whatever composition it was they had that week. And it's kind of seen a resurgence in the last 10 years, albeit in a very different fashion. So that's another
uh-huh.
example. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I
Yeah,
don't
there's
know in
so many.
Philadelphia if you have any like jazz bars with people with bongos in the background or whatever, or do you?
I think there are some, you know, I'm a mom, so I'm usually at home, not at the jazz bars,
Right.
but yeah.
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 Yeah. But we're always listening to music, and I think
Good. Good.
it's interesting just how, every culture has you have those oral traditions, but
Mm,
things that go with a rhythm, whether it's poetry, whether it's music, it really sticks to us and we remember it. And
yeah.
so, yeah.
And then before you know it, it starts going into your prose after a while. You're going, this flows really well. I like it.
Yeah. Now, when you're editing, do you read your work out loud to yourself to kind of check for that flow and rhythm?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have a kind of a. I'm fortunate in that I'm not very precious. I kind of like to I actually said to my editor, be brutal, just brutalize us, be show me no mercy. I want you to
Mhm.
because my issue is that rather than getting precious about what I do, I kind of know I'm too close to us to be able to look at it impartially.
Yeah.
Mind you, I do this other thing where I get up, I might be working away, and then I'll get up, say, right, 10-minute break, go down, get a coffee, whatever, and surf social media for a little bit, and then you get this kind of, and then you return to it, and then you realize you can look at what you just wrote with a certain with a clearer eye, you know.
Yeah.
But the discipline is knowing to do that, and that I don't always have that. I get very just worked up, and then I'm getting to the point now where I know, okay, take a break. Let's take a break, come back, look at it with cooler eyes, you'll be fine. But
And then sometimes you look and you're like, yes, I'm a genius. And then sometimes you're like, that's a stinking pile of poo. You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
it's funny how that goes.
And you never know what it's going to be. So
Right.
that's just the job. That's just the job.
Yeah.
I think.
Yep. That's where those critique partners are great because they can give you that perspective.
Yeah, I just need someone to look at it with a to look at it with an impartial eye, which usually people are, and just say, how does it come off? You know, does it work for
Yeah.
you? If you came across this in an airport lounge before 6 hours, would you want to read
Yeah.
this? You know, and it's and that for me that's quite useful. I mean, I gave up. Just I kind of there's no point just being kind of precious about it. Just going, look, just give me the edits.
Yeah.
Just give me the edits. I want to make this
Yeah.
thing very good. I want Hemingway himself to just show up and as a ghost and just say it and tell me, he wouldn't make it good.
He wouldn't pull any punches.
No, literally
Yeah.
not. But
Yeah.
what about you when you're editing? Is that the same or is that a
Yeah, definitely. I have a couple of fellow authors that we all had the same agent starting out.
yeah,
We got together and we're like, okay, we're going to make a Skype critique group. And so we've been together for several years. Even though that agent is not in the business anymore and we've all kind of moved on, we still stay real tight and we're all very honest with each other. And, and then we all get on social media and share news or cry or, whatever.
yeah,
So I think you really need those people to keep you sane.
yeah.
Um, I'm
Particularly,
fortunate that yeah, I'm fortunate that my husband will read for me and he'll tell me the truth too, like nicely. He doesn't call it a stinking pile of poo, but he will be like, no, So I'll usually show him first, and then I'll send it to my critique group. But I appreciate that, and and he'll be like, I've read like 20 versions of this. I don't even know anymore. Like neither do I. So you do kind of need those fresh eyes sometimes
yeah,
because you get so far down your own rabbit hole and your own
you do,
thoughts that you don't
you do.
remember what you said or what you deleted. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I
and
really
there's
enjoy even just today, I was at to copy and paste a new part of my manuscript because the email just wasn't. It was a technical thing. It wasn't really working so well. But I had to go over. But it was I had to go over like 2 months of changes I'd made. You know, and luckily I had them all marked off. But there were so many of them. I was going, Jesus. And
I
then
know.
before I knew it, I had an extra 10,000 words down. And I was going, is that good or bad? I honestly don't know
Yeah.
anymore.
I know. That's when you need to like take a break and drink a
Yeah,
bottle of wine and get
I
up the next
I
day.
would, but I'm on a deadline. I'm off the sauce. So I don't have that concept. Once a Catholic, always a Catholic, Lindsay. I'm telling you. Never,
See, and I grew up like evangelical, so but I'm not religious either anymore. So yeah,
there's not a badge on the wall behind me, but that's purely a strategic thing because
aesthetic.
I like to come in.
Yeah.
So, uh,
All
so if
right.
anyone in the
Do we
question
want to
comment,
ask if? Well, I'm
sorry,
sorry. You first for a sec. For
is anyone watching any questions or comments, if at all? I'll just have a look now because I'm on full screen. Um,
that's exactly what I was gonna say. You read my mind.
ask me anything. My shoe size, my morning routine. Yeah.
Yep, me too. You can ask whatever.
Anything about 18th century literature,
I'll
anything
ask you a
about
random question.
rebellion.
I'll ask you a random question, Daniel. Are you a morning person or a night owl?
I'm somewhere in between. Kind of depends.
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
I'm that rare species that occasionally gets up very early, and then stays up very late, and then somehow manages to do it again because I'm just used to the insomnia.
There you go. I'm totally night owl. I have
Yeah,
been. My mom says I have been since I was born.
yeah.
So
The world's not made for night owls. I feel my heart goes out to night owls. They don't get the they
I
don't
know
get enough.
it's tough.
I mean,
My kids are too, and mornings are rough.
yeah. And now work has just changed so much. Now we have to do work over Zoom calls now. That's what it
Yeah.
goes for a lot of people. And I was doing this before COVID. I'm a writer. This is how it works. And you're going
Yeah.
now everyone else has to do it, and we're staring down screens that occasionally blip right at the crucial moment you're delivering a proper presentation. Terrible.
Okay, looks like everybody's asking for covers. Do you have your cover yet?
I have my cover. I'll try and I'm not very good because I'm technologically literate. I will try and show you this version of the cover
Okay,
on
cool. You go
on my
first.
iPad. So here we are. People can see this is
Ooh.
the cover of A Land Without Wolves.
Ooh, it looks so foggy and
Yeah, and
atmospheric. I love it.
the abbey that people are seeing there, that's a real abbey. It's in the county of Wexford in Ireland. It's called Tintern Abbey. It's not the Tintern Abbey that Wordsworth immortalised, though apparently it was based around the same building plan. And it really is that forbidding looking in real life. And the opening scene where McTira meets his young protege in a very violent attack on a bridge. That's the opening scene, more or less. And yeah, so
Very
looking forward
nice.
to that.
I like it. I can't wait
Thank
to
you.
read it. I'll show you mine again. Here it is. This is the hardcover. My paperback is coming out this fall, but you can buy the hardcover and the ebook now. It's National Indie Bookstore Day, so if you'd like to go on Bookshop, my book is on Annie's Bookshop page with the rate review. But Zena Keynes did my cover design, and I was so happy with it. She incorporated the eye jewelry and the swan feathers and a little bit of blood going down there to give it a good ominous feel.
Yeah,
Zena, my designer, actually, she's a sculptor too.
right.
So she made several pieces of this eye jewelry. She like handcrafted it. It was so cool. She did it for my
Yeah,
release. But the jewelry definitely plays a big part in her family history, and there are a lot of parallels for her for the decisions she has to make too. So it's
yeah.
a big story. So.
How bad must it be for graphic designers when someone says, "Don't judge a book by its cover"? They put a lot of work into that.
Everybody does. I do it, right? Yeah, it matters a lot.
I'm getting
Did
I'm
you
getting
get
Annie's
did you get
Annie.
input into your
I'm
oh, I'm
sorry.
sorry. Blips. Did you get input into your cover design?
I did, yeah. Becca Bjork is the designer for mine. She's based out in Washington. Although we call her Gaia. Gaia is her name. And
Okay.
she did a lot of the genius course for that. I'm just getting a thing off Annie McDonald. Annie, who's basically our kind of the godmother of the right review. Annie's like the head honcho. Annie's Annie's the reason why we're all here, really. So
Yeah. Annie, do
and
you want to be? Do we call you the fairy godmother or just the regular godmother? I mean,
I
I
meant
don't
as in the female. I meant as in the female equivalent of Don Corleone, but that's the that was
know. Wow.
we're a literary mafiosi here. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
Annie's asked me to mention my chapbook, Iceberg Relief, which if you're interested, you can get on Amazon. It was published by Underdog Press in Los Angeles, and it's a series of prose poems based around the kidnapping of the crew of the ship, the MV Iceberg, in 2013, and it has the dubious honor of being the longest ever kidnapping at sea in recent history. I think it lasted about 4 years. We're talking a ship basically in plain sight of the shore, and its crew were held captive below decks. And so, if that intrigues you, you can get online in digital form. And
Why don't you
oh yeah,
put the link? Put the link, like
link.
in the right review, so we can find it.
I will.
Okay. Okay.
And
Cool.
also my debut collection, Rapids, is coming out by Finishing Line Press in August. So watch the space.
Cool.
I'm very proud of self-promo.
So Annie had also asked us, what's next for us? Do you have something else you're working on?
I've always
After,
got something.
yeah.
I've always got something I'm working on. I'd love to. We're currently working on a few plays and film scripts as well, dabbling, and hopefully that'll keep me occupied throughout the coming year. So we'll watch the space, as I say. There's always.
Yeah.
I'm never done with my hands always in some pie. So
Yeah.
you'll
Always
never know.
have a lot of tabs open in the
Yeah,
brain. Yeah.
always. I never know where the music is coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, I am finishing up a few edits on my next novel, which is different from Nemesis and Swan. It's set in modern day New York and 1911 Coney Island and 1600s Ireland. So it's a triple timeline, and it involves some mythology with the fates. So it has a little bit of a speculative element. It's different, but it also feels very much like a me book. It's got all my thoughts and feelings in there, I guess. But it's going to be billed as young adult also, but with that adult crossover. So I'm excited for that one. And it goes into like tattooed freak history and all kinds of wacky stuff. So I enjoy doing a lot of tattoo history. I only have 2 tattoos. I'm not the tattooed woman, but tattoo history is interesting as you think about body ownership and art history. So I really explored a lot of those thoughts of choice and who am I, how do I look, and what kind of control do I have over that. So
Right.
yeah, so I'm excited for that one to be done.
Well, one final one for me, if anyone's curious. We mentioned spoken word earlier on, and I have a spoken word album out as well called Embers and Earth, and you can get that on Amazon and Spotify, and it's all sorts of different musicians from Ireland, and a rake load of genres from jazz to trad to rock to, and in one case, a very interesting interpretation of contemporary classical. And you'll have to see which one to find out. And if any James Joyce heads watching, See State Martello is a short film I did in tribute to Joyce, and we're re-releasing that in June for Bloomsday. So again, watch the space.
Cool. Yeah, add the links so we can check it out. Sounds good. Yeah.
I keep forgetting all the stuff I got to plug. It's what I keep forgetting. Irish self-deprecation.
All right. Well, do we have any other questions? Anything else? I think we're like 2 minutes past our 1 hour, aren't we?
Yeah. That's what happens when we talk. That's what happens when we talk about the enlightenment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk, Dan. It was great to meet you and great to learn more about you. I'm excited to check out this iceberg thing and the spoken word. It sounds great. So.
Cool. Okay, Lindsay. Great talking to you.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.